For a long time, it seemed Antarctica would remain the sole holdout in a nearly fully explored world. The approaches were too difficult and dangerous, and the material benefits to the exploring nations were too few. No crops or minerals were waiting in the wilderness beneath the Antarctic Circle. Far from being a land of plenty, the Antarctic continent, if it was that, was no place for human beings. James Cook, the first navigator to cross the Circle, found he had to contend with the stormiest, most iceberg-strewn seas in the world. Then he ran up against a hard obstacle in the shape of a vast belt of pack ice. Sailing into the pack seemed tantamount to suicide, and it stopped Cook in his tracks between 1772 and 1775. He followed the ice edge until he had completed a full circumnavigation of the Earth at a high latitude, but he saw no land, only wide, rolling ice fields. There was still enough room for a hypothetical continent twice the size of Australia in the region Cook had skirted, but he thought if any land existed, it must be condemned to everlasting rigidity by nature and useless to the discoverer. The next explorer to cross the Circle was the Russian Captain Bellingshausen, more than 40 years later. Armed with Cook's books and charts, Bellingshausen completed another high-latitude circumnavigation of the Earth. It seemed certain that he sighted the Antarctic continent several times during his voyage, but he did not realize what he was looking at, because the land was covered in ice. The Russian did not penetrate beyond Cook's highest southern latitude, 71 degrees and 10 minutes. That honour went to James Weddell, one of the hundreds of whalers and sealers who were now venturing into the Southern Ocean in search of fresh hunting grounds. The year after Bellingshausen had returned to Russia, Weddell crossed the Circle from the Atlantic side, and finding the ice conditions unusually open, surpassed Cook's record by more than 300 miles. He saw nothing but open sea before him and had to turn back on account of low supplies. The next long strides towards understanding the Antarctic landmass did not take place until a generation later, when mid-Victorian scientists became interested in measuring the Earth's magnetic field. In 1839, James Clark Ross sailed from Chatham in command of two heavy bomb ships, the Erebus and Terra. He arrived in Hobart to find the French Commodore d'Urville and the American Lieutenant Wilkes had already gone on ahead of him. Instead of sailing due south from Hobart like his rivals, Ross took a more easterly track, and at the Antarctic Circle found himself opposed by heavy masses of pack ice. With his fortified ships, he did something Cook and Bellingshausen would have deemed impossible. He plunged directly into the pack and continued to drive his way to the south. 5 days later, he broke through to an open sea on the far side, and land loomed ahead of him. The pack, he discovered, had been guarding a vast region of mountains and glaciers. He claimed the land for Britain, naming it after Queen Victoria, and went south along the coast. For 360 miles, the mountains ran on his starboard side like battlements of rock and ice. Somewhere beyond the mountains lay his original object, the position assigned to the South Magnetic Pole by Carl Gauss. That point would be impossible to reach, but the way to the geographical South Pole, directly south, appeared to be open. It seemed the coast would lead Ross all the way to the pole, until he encountered a 200-foot wall of ice through which he had no more power of sailing than through the cliffs of Dover.